My mother has syphilis. My son's voice carried through the country club like a bell tolling at a funeral. I was standing 15 feet away, near the buffet table, a champagne flute in my hand. Everything stopped. The conversations, the laughter, the clinking of ice in glasses. Every head turned toward me. I watched the faces shift from confusion to something worse, pity mixed with disgust. That single sentence, spoken loud enough for 40 people to hear, rewrote my entire life in an instant. I set the champagne down carefully. My fingers felt numb. The glass made a soft sound against the marble table, but it might as well have been a gunshot. Around me, the country club's summer gala continued its momentum, but I had become the center of a sudden, terrible gravity. People looked away quickly, the way you look away from a car accident. Some whispered. I could see their mouths moving. I could see them calculating distances, deciding whether to approach me or avoid me entirely. My son, Marcus, stood across the room with his wife, Evangeline. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was smiling, talking to someone about his golf handicap, as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my life, as if he hadn't just announced to every significant person in this town that I had a sexually transmitted disease, as if he hadn't just guaranteed that by tomorrow morning, the story would be everywhere. I needed to leave. The thought came to me clearly, cutting through the static of shock. If I stayed, it would confirm something. If I stayed, people would approach me with sympathy or questions, and I would have to stand there and deny something I shouldn't have to deny. I moved toward the exit, my legs working on autopilot. No one stopped me. No one followed. They were too busy processing what they'd heard, too busy deciding how to tell this story to everyone who wasn't here. The parking lot was cool and empty. My car sat under the lights, a silver Mercedes I'd bought myself 5 years ago when my divorce from Marcus's father had finally been finalized. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes without starting the engine. My hands were steady now, but my mind was racing through possibilities. Had he said this before? Had he told other people? How long had this been happening? The drive home took 20 minutes. I lived in a renovated Victorian on Maple Street, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a wraparound porch that I'd spent 3 years restoring. It was my sanctuary, the place I'd built after the divorce, the place that proved I could stand alone. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car again, staring at the dark windows of my house. The porch light was on. Everything looked normal. Everything looked like a lie. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine. Not champagne. Something stronger. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I needed to understand what was happening. I searched my son's name first. Nothing came up immediately. Then I tried searching his name with the country club's name. Nothing. I tried searching my own name with the word he'd used. Nothing yet. But it would come. By morning, it would be everywhere. These things always spread faster than the truth. I called my daughter Iris first. She was younger than Marcus by 4 years, lived 2 states away, worked in pharmaceutical sales. She answered on the second ring, her voice still thick with sleep. I could hear her husband in the background asking who was calling at this hour. Iris, it's Mom. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Mom, are you okay? It's almost midnight. Has Marcus said anything to you? About me? About my health? There was a pause. A long one. Long enough for me to know the answer before she gave it. What? No. Mom, what's going on? I told her what he'd said at the country club. I heard her gasp. I heard her hand over the phone. Heard her telling her husband something. Heard him react with shock. When she came back on the line, Her voice had changed. It had the quality of someone who was trying very hard to stay calm. "Mom, that's insane. Why would he say that?" "I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out." "Have you called him?" "Not yet." Call him. Call him right now. This is crazy." I hung up and stared at my phone. The time was 12:47 a.m. I could call him. I could demand an explanation. I could scream at him about what he'd done. But something stopped me. Something in the back of my mind whispered that this wasn't random. This wasn't a drunken mistake or a cruel joke. This was intentional. This was strategic. And I needed to understand why before I confronted him. I opened my email instead. I searched for messages from Marcus from the past 6 months. There were dozens. Most were casual. "Mom, can you send me the recipe for your lasagna?" "Mom, Evangeline wants to know if you're coming to her sister's birthday." "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's estate." That last one caught my attention. I clicked on it. The email was from 3 weeks ago. It was brief. Marcus had written that they needed to discuss how my father's estate would be handled. My father had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving his considerable fortune to be divided among his 3 children. I was the executor. The email asked if we could meet to discuss the distribution. I'd replied that I was working on the paperwork and would have everything ready within the month. I'd thought it was a simple administrative matter. Now I wasn't sure. I searched for other emails. There was one from Evangeline from 4 months ago. It was asking if I could help them with a down payment on a new house. They'd found something they loved but were short about $80,000. Could I help? I'd replied that I couldn't afford that I was comfortable but not wealthy, that they needed to work with their bank or save more. The email had gone unanswered. Then there was an email from 2 weeks ago, from Marcus again. It said, "Mom, we really need to talk about your financial situation. Evangeline is concerned about your future. We should discuss it soon." I'd never replied to that one. I'd been busy with work. I'd thought it was presumptuous. Now I understood. It wasn't concern. It was reconnaissance. I poured another glass of wine and sat with my laptop until 3 in the morning, reading through every email, every text, every message I could find. I was looking for a pattern. I was looking for the moment when my son had decided that I was a problem that needed to be solved. I was looking for the moment when he'd decided that the truth didn't matter as much as getting what he wanted. By the time the sun came up, I had a theory. It wasn't a complete picture, but it was enough to make me understand that something was very wrong. The first thing I did was call my doctor. Dr. Patricia Brennan had been my physician for 12 years. I explained what had happened at the country club, and I asked for a complete health screening. I wanted blood work. I wanted everything tested. I wanted documentation that would prove, beyond any doubt, that what Marcus had said was a lie. Dr. Brennan was kind about it, but I could hear the question in her voice. "Why would your son say something like that?" I didn't have a good answer. I told her I'd explain later. I scheduled the appointment for that afternoon. The second thing I did was call my attorney. His name was Robert Shelton, and he specialized in family law and estate matters. I'd used him for my divorce, and I'd consulted with him about my father's estate. I asked him if we could meet urgently. He agreed to see me at 4 o'clock. The third thing I did was call my sister Eleanor. She lived in the same town as Marcus, about 30 minutes away. She'd been at the country club gala the night before. She'd heard what he'd said. When she answered the phone, her voice was tight with anger. "I can't believe he did that," she said. "I can't believe he would say something so vicious." "Did you talk to him after? Did he say anything?" "No. Evangeline dragged him out of there about an hour after you left. Everyone was talking about it. It was the worst kind of gossip, Unaola. The kind where everyone pretends they don't believe it, but they're all wondering if it might be true. I know. What are you going to do? I'm trying to figure that out. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you thought about why he would do this? There has to be a reason." I'm working on it. After I hung up with Eleanor, I sat on my porch and tried to think about my relationship with Marcus. He was 38 years old. He'd been a difficult child, prone to tantrums, quick to blame others for his failures. He'd never quite forgiven me for divorcing his father, even though his father had been unfaithful and emotionally abusive. Marcus had always sided with him, had always made me feel like I was the villain in that story. When Marcus had gotten married to Evangeline 6 years ago, I'd hoped things would improve. I'd tried to be a good mother-in-law. I'd helped them with their wedding. I'd given them a generous gift. I'd tried to include them in family events, but Evangeline had always been cold to me. She was polite in public, but dismissive in private. She'd made it clear that she didn't think I was a good influence on Marcus. She'd discouraged him from spending time with me. Over the years, I'd seen less and less of my son. 2 years ago, when my father had passed away and left me a substantial inheritance, things had shifted again. Marcus had suddenly become interested in spending time with me. He'd started calling more frequently. He'd asked about my financial situation. He'd hinted that he and Evangeline were struggling. He'd suggested that maybe I could help them out. I'd been careful about it. I'd given them some money for Christmas. I'd helped with a car payment when they were in a bind, but I'd been cautious about giving them too much. I'd learned from my divorce that money could be used as a weapon. I'd learned that generosity could be twisted into obligation. Now, I understood that Marcus's renewed interest in me had nothing to do with love or reconnection. It had everything to do with my bank account. And when I'd refused to give him as much as he wanted, he'd decided to destroy me instead. My appointment with Dr. Brennan was thorough. She took blood samples, ran tests, asked detailed questions about my medical history. She was professional and kind, but I could see her curiosity. She wanted to know why I was suddenly so concerned about my health. I told her the truth. I told her what Marcus had said at the country club. I watched her face shift from professional concern to something closer to anger. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "And also a serious lie, if it's not true." "I know. I'll have these results back within a week. In the meantime, I want you to know that even if there's any truth to what he said, it's treatable. It's not the death sentence people think it is." "There's no truth to it," I said. She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded. "I believe you, but we'll have the documentation to prove it." My meeting with Robert Shelton was more complicated. I explained the situation to him, and I watched his expression become increasingly serious. "This is defamation," he said. "If he said this publicly, and if he said it with the intent to damage your reputation, you might have a legal case." "Can I sue him?" "You could, but it would be messy. He's your son." The court would likely encourage mediation first, and frankly, a lawsuit would only spread the story further. It would make it bigger news. So what do? First, you document everything, you get the medical tests, you get evidence that what he said is false. Then you send him a cease and desist letter. You tell him that if he continues to make these statements, you will pursue legal action. Sometimes that's enough to make people stop. And if it's not, then you consider your options. But I want to be honest with you, Unaola. This is going to hurt. Your reputation is going to take a hit. Some people will believe him. Some people will assume there's no smoke without fire. That's just how human nature works. I left his office feeling hollowed out. I'd known this intellectually, but hearing it from an attorney made it real. My life was about to change in ways I couldn't control. The blood work came back 3 days later. Everything was normal. Everything was clean. Dr. Brennan called me personally to tell me, and she offered to provide me with official documentation if I needed it. I thanked her and asked her to send me copies of all the test results. I wanted them in writing. I wanted them official and dated and impossible to dispute. In the meantime, the story had started to spread. I could feel it in the way people treated me. The woman at the grocery store who usually chatted with me about the weather suddenly became very focused on scanning my items. The neighbor who always waved when I drove past now looked away. The ladies at my book club had stopped calling to remind me of meetings. I went to work as usual. I was a project manager for a commercial real estate development company, a job I'd held for 15 years. My boss, Kenneth, called me into his office on Friday. I knew what was coming before I sat down. "Unaola, I need to talk to you about something that's been brought to my attention," he said. He was uncomfortable. I could see it in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "There's been some talk, some gossip about your personal health situation." "What kind of gossip?" "I'd rather not repeat it, but it's affecting the office environment. Some of the staff have expressed concern about working with you." My chest tightened. I forced myself to breathe. "What exactly are they concerned about?" "They're concerned about your health status. They're worried about contamination or disease transmission." I set the medical documentation on his desk. "I've had a complete physical. Everything is normal. I have documentation from my physician. And frankly, even if I had any health condition, it would be protected by HIPAA and would have no bearing on my ability to do my job." Kenneth looked at the documents. He looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure that's all fine, Unaola. I just wanted to address the concern." "The concern is based on a lie that my son told at a public event. A lie with no basis in fact. And the fact that it's affecting my employment is something I might need to discuss with an attorney." I watched him pale. He nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm sorry this is happening. For what it's worth, I believe you." "Do you?" "Yes, I do." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. I could see him doing the calculation that everyone else was doing. Was there any possibility it was true? Was there any smoke? And even if there wasn't, was it worth the risk to be associated with me? I went home and called Robert Shelton again. I told him about the situation at work. He was quiet for a long moment. "This is escalating," he said. "I think it's time we sent that cease and desist letter." "Do it." I sat in my office at work and watched as Robert's letter was delivered to Marcus's house. It was formal and legal and devastating. It outlined what Marcus had said. It explained that the statements were false and defamatory. It demanded that he cease and desist from making any further statements about my health. It warned that continued violations could result in legal action. I waited for Marcus to call. I waited for him to apologize or explain or defend himself. He didn't. Instead, the silence became its own kind of weapon. 2 weeks later, I was having lunch with Eleanor at a cafe near her house. She'd been supportive throughout this nightmare, but I could see the toll it was taking on her too. She was my sister, and by association, she was now tainted by my alleged disease. "Have you talked to Marcus?" she asked. "Not since the country club. Evangeline called me yesterday. She wanted to know if I thought you might drop the cease and desist letter if they apologized." I set down my fork. "They're willing to apologize?" "That's what she said. She said Marcus was drunk when he said it. She said he didn't mean it. She said he's very sorry and wants to make it right." He was not drunk, I said quietly. I watched him the entire evening. He was completely sober. And he said it loud enough for 40 people to hear. That's not a drunken mistake. That's a deliberate act. I know. Why are they reaching out to you? Why not reach out to me directly? Eleanor looked uncomfortable. I think they're afraid of you. I think they're afraid of the lawsuit. Good. But even as I said it, I felt something crack inside me. This was my son. This was the child I'd carried in my body, the child I'd raised, the child I'd loved through every stage of his life. And now we were enemies. Now we were in a legal battle. Now he was trying to use intermediaries to negotiate a peace that would benefit him, not me. I finished my lunch and drove home. I sat on my porch and looked at my house. I'd worked so hard to build this life. I'd worked so hard to prove that I could be independent, that I could be successful, that I could be happy on my own. And my own son had decided to tear it all down because I wouldn't give him money. That night, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I called Marcus. He answered on the third ring. Hello? It's your mother. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. I could hear Evangeline in the background asking who it was. Mom? Hi. I wasn't expecting... I need to understand something. I need to understand why you did this. Did what? Don't play dumb. You told everyone at the country club that I have syphilis. I need to know why. Another pause. This one was longer. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was harder. It was colder. You wouldn't help us? He said. What? You wouldn't help us. We asked you for money. We asked you nicely. We explained our situation. And you said no. You said you couldn't afford it. But then we found out about your father's inheritance. We found out you had money. You just didn't want to give it to us. That's my money, Marcus. That's money that I earned and that was left to me. I'm not obligated to give it to you. You're my mother. Yes, I am. And you're my son. And what you did was unforgivable. So you're going to sue me? I'm going to do whatever I need to do to protect myself. You're going to destroy this family over money. No, I said. You destroyed this family over money? You just did it in a way that was designed to hurt me? I hung up before he could respond. I set the phone down and sat in the dark. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from rage. From the pure, crystalline clarity of understanding that my son had made his choice, and I was going to have to make mine. The cease and desist letter didn't work, or rather, it worked for a while, but then the damage had already been done. The story had taken on a life of its own. It had become the kind of rumor that didn't need Marcus to keep telling it. Other people were telling it for him. They were embellishing it. They were adding details that had never happened. I heard that I'd gotten it from a lover. I heard that I'd hidden it from my family for years. I heard that I'd been a nurse and had infected patients. None of it was true. All of it was devastating. My book club stopped inviting me to meetings. The woman at the grocery store started shopping at a different store. The neighbor stopped waving. People who had been friendly for years suddenly had reasons to avoid me. It was like watching my entire life be erased by a single lie. I threw myself into work, but even that was becoming difficult. Kenneth had been supportive, but I could see the pressure he was under. Other staff members were complaining. Clients were asking questions. My presence was becoming a liability. I made a decision. I scheduled a meeting with Kenneth and told him I was taking a leave of absence. I needed time to deal with this situation. I needed to figure out what I was going to do. He tried to convince me to stay, But he also looked relieved. I could see him calculating how much easier his life would be without me in the office. I had savings. I had my inheritance. I could afford to take time off. What I couldn't afford was to stay in a place where I was slowly being erased. I spent 3 weeks doing very little. I stayed home. I read books. I took long walks. I tried to process what had happened and what it meant. I tried to understand how my son could have done this to me. I tried to forgive him, and I couldn't. I tried to understand him, and I couldn't do that either. Robert called me during the 3rd week. He had news. He'd been contacted by Evangeline's attorney. They were offering a settlement. If I would drop the cease and desist letter and agree not to pursue legal action, they would pay me $50,000. "It's an insult," Robert said, "but it might be worth considering. They're trying to buy my silence." Yes. I don't want their money. I know, but sometimes accepting money is a way of having the last word. Sometimes it's a way of making them understand that their actions have consequences. I thought about it for a long time. Then I told Robert to reject the offer. I told him to tell them that I was pursuing legal action. I was going to sue Marcus for defamation. I was going to take this to trial. And I was going to make sure that everyone in this town understood that what he'd done was wrong. Robert tried to talk me out of it. He explained the costs, the time, the emotional toll. He explained that even if I won, I would only be spreading the story further. He explained that there were no winners in a lawsuit like this. "I don't care," I said. "I'm tired of being quiet. I'm tired of letting him control the narrative. I'm going to fight." The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later. It was public record. It was in the local news. The headline read, "Woman Sues Son for Defamation Over Health Claims." The story explained what had happened. It explained that Marcus had made false statements about my health at a public event. It explained that I had medical documentation proving the statements were false. It explained that I was seeking damages. And then the story took on a different shape, because now people had to choose. They had to decide whether they believed Marcus or whether they believed me. They had to decide whether my son was a liar or whether I was a liar. They had to choose a side. Some people chose mine. Eleanor rallied to my defense. She gave interviews. She explained what Marcus was like, how he'd always been difficult, how he'd always resented me for leaving his father. Iris came home for a week and made public statements about how shocked she was by what her brother had done. My book club sent me a letter saying they'd made a mistake in excluding me, and they wanted me back. But some people chose Marcus's side. Or rather, they chose neutrality, which was its own kind of betrayal. They said things like, "Family matters should stay private," and "I don't want to get involved," and "I'm sure there's truth on both sides." There wasn't truth on both sides. There was truth on one side and lies on the other. But people didn't want to accept that. People wanted to believe that these things were complicated, that there were shades of gray, that both people had valid points. The trial was scheduled for 8 months later. 8 months of waiting, 8 months of legal fees and depositions and discovery, 8 months of living in limbo, knowing that my reputation was on trial along with my son's character. I used those 8 months to rebuild my life. I quit my job officially. I took the severance package and the reference letter from Kenneth, who was grateful to be rid of the problem I represented. I used my inheritance to start a consulting business. I worked from home, doing project management for small companies that didn't care about my reputation because they'd never heard of me. I made new friends. I joined a different book club. I started volunteering at a local nonprofit that helped women in difficult situations. I built a new life that didn't depend on the approval of people who'd known me before. and I prepared for trial. Robert and I went through everything. We prepared my testimony. We prepared witnesses. We documented every aspect of what Marcus had done and what it had cost me. The trial lasted 3 days. It was held in the county courthouse, in a small room with wood paneling and uncomfortable chairs. Marcus sat at the defense table with his attorney, a slick man named David Brennan who specialized in defending people accused of defamation. Evangeline sat in the gallery, her face carefully neutral. I testified for 2 hours. I explained what Marcus had said. I explained where he'd said it. I explained who had heard it. I explained how it had affected my life. I showed the medical documentation. I showed the emails. I showed the evidence of his motive, the requests for money, the rejection of those requests, the subsequent defamation. Marcus testified too. He admitted that he'd said it, but he claimed it was a joke. He claimed he was trying to be funny. He claimed I was overreacting. He claimed that I'd always been oversensitive and that I was using this as an excuse to punish him because I'd never forgiven him for siding with his father in the divorce. His attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive mother who was destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding. He tried to make it seem like I was the villain in this story. He tried to suggest that maybe there was some truth to what Marcus had said, that maybe I was hiding something. But the judge wasn't buying it. The judge was a woman named Patricia Hoffman, and she had a daughter of her own. She listened carefully to the testimony. She reviewed the evidence. She understood that this was about a son who had deliberately lied about his mother in a public setting, and that the lie had caused real damage. After 3 days, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with a verdict: guilty of defamation. The judge awarded me $200,000 in damages. Marcus's face went white. Evangeline started to cry. His attorney immediately began talking about appeals. But it was over. I had won. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. The money was transferred to my account within a month. I donated half of it to the nonprofit I'd been volunteering for. I used the other half to pay off my mortgage and invest in my consulting business. The money didn't fix anything. It didn't restore my reputation. It didn't bring back the friendships I'd lost. It didn't undo what had been said about me. But it did something else. It proved that I had been right. It proved that Marcus had lied. It proved that the truth mattered, even when the truth was hard and painful and required fighting for. I didn't hear from Marcus after the trial. He didn't call. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to make amends. I heard through Eleanor that he and Evangeline had moved to another state. I heard that he'd gotten a new job. I heard that they were trying to start over somewhere where no one knew about the lawsuit. I understood the impulse. I understood wanting to escape your past. But I also understood that you couldn't escape it. You could only move forward and hope that the future was better than the past. 6 months after the trial, I was invited to speak at a women's empowerment conference. They wanted me to talk about my experience. They wanted me to tell women how to fight back against defamation and lies and the damage that family members could do. I almost said no. I didn't want to be defined by this experience. I didn't want to be the woman whose son had lied about her. But then I thought about all the other women who were going through similar situations. I thought about all the mothers who had been betrayed by their children. I thought about all the women who had been silenced by shame and lies. I said yes. I stood in front of 300 women and told them my story. I told them about the lie. I told them about the damage. I told them about the fight. I told them about winning in court but losing so much else. I told them that the victory had been hollow, but it had also been necessary. And I told them this: your reputation is not your worth. What people say about you is not the truth about who you are. If you know that you are innocent, then you have to be willing to fight for that innocence, even when it's painful, even when it costs you, even when you lose people you love in the process. Because the alternative is to let lies define you. And that's a worse fate than any court verdict. After the conference, women came up to me and told me their stories. Daughters who had lied about their mothers. Sons who had betrayed their parents. Families torn apart by deception and greed. I listened to all of them, and I understood that what had happened to me was not unique. It was just one variation on a theme that played out in families across the country every single day. One woman told me that her son had accused her of stealing from him. Another woman told me that her daughter had told everyone she was an alcoholic. A third woman told me that her son had claimed she'd abused him as a child, which was completely false. "How do you survive it?" one woman asked me. "You don't survive it," I told her. "You live through it. You acknowledge that it happened. You grieve what you lost. And then you build something new." 3 years after the trial, I was sitting on my porch on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. The weather was beautiful. The flowers in my garden were blooming. My consulting business was thriving. I had friends. I had purpose. I had a life that I'd built for myself, brick by brick, after everything had fallen apart. My phone rang. It was Eleanor. "Hi," she said. "I wanted to give you a heads up. Marcus is coming back to town." My stomach tightened. "When?" "Next week. He and Evangeline are visiting. They want to see people." "Are they going to try to contact me?" "I don't know. I thought you should know." After I hung up, I sat with that information for a long time. Marcus was coming back. The person who had destroyed my reputation, who had lied about me in front of 40 people, who had set in motion a chain of events that had cost me my job and my friendships and my peace of mind, he was coming back to town. I could see him if I wanted to. I could confront him. I could tell him how much damage he'd done. I could demand an apology. I could try to repair the relationship. But I didn't want to do any of those things. I had moved on. I had built a new life. I had found peace. And I understood that seeing Marcus again would only drag me back into that pain. It would only remind me of what I'd lost. It would only reopen wounds that had finally healed. So I made a decision. I decided to stay away. I decided to let him visit and reconnect with other family members if they wanted to see him. But I was going to protect myself. I was going to protect my peace. When Eleanor called to tell me that Marcus had asked about me, I told her to tell him that I wasn't interested in seeing him. I told her to tell him that I'd moved on and that I hoped he had too. I told her that I wished him well, but that our relationship was over. Eleanor tried to convince me to reconsider. She said that he was her brother, that he was family, that maybe he'd changed, but I was firm. Some relationships can be repaired. Some relationships can be healed, but some relationships are broken in ways that can't be fixed. And I'd learned to recognize the difference. Marcus left town after a week. I didn't see him. I didn't hear from him. And I was okay with that. Today, 5 years after the lie was told, I'm a different person than I was before. I'm stronger in some ways. I've learned that I can survive things I never thought I could survive. I've learned that the truth matters, even when it's hard to fight for. I've learned that my reputation is not my worth, and that what people say about me says more about them than it does about me. But I'm also more cautious. I'm more careful about who I trust. I'm more aware of how quickly relationships can be weaponized. I'm more conscious of the fact that family bonds are not always stronger than greed or resentment or the desire to hurt someone. I still think about Marcus sometimes. I still feel the sting of what he did. I still grieve the relationship I thought we had and the relationship I'd hoped we could have. But I don't hate him. I don't wish him harm. I simply acknowledge that he made a choice, and I made a choice in response, and now we live separate lives. I've learned that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I've learned that you can forgive someone and still choose not to have them in your life. I've learned that protecting yourself is not the same as holding a grudge. My consulting business has grown. I have clients across the country. I work from my home office, and I've built a career that's entirely my own. I don't depend on anyone else's approval or support. I don't need anyone to validate my worth. I've also become an advocate for women who've been defamed or betrayed by family members. I speak at conferences. I write articles. I mentor women who are going through similar situations. I've turned my pain into purpose, and I've found that to be healing in ways I never expected. Iris and I are closer now than we've ever been. Eleanor and I have rebuilt our relationship. I have a community of friends who know my story and who support me. I have a life that's full and meaningful and entirely my own. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just given Marcus the money he wanted. If I'd said yes to his requests, if I'd funded his dreams, if I'd been a different kind of mother. But I know the answer. I would have been enabling him. I would have been teaching him that lies and manipulation were acceptable ways to get what he wanted. I would have been sacrificing my own well-being for his comfort. Instead, I chose to fight. I chose to tell the truth. I chose to protect myself. And yes, it cost me. It cost me relationships and friendships and peace of mind, but it also gave me something invaluable. It gave me my self-respect. It gave me the knowledge that I had stood up for myself, that I had refused to be silenced, that I had chosen truth over comfort. If you're going through something similar, if someone you love has betrayed you or lied about you or tried to destroy your reputation, I want you to know this. You are not alone. What happened to you is not your fault, and you have the right to fight back, to tell your truth, to protect yourself. The road will be hard. You will lose things. You will grieve. But on the other side of that grief, there is the possibility of a life that's entirely your own, built on your own terms, defined by your own choices. That's what I found, and I hope you find it too.